I want to thank Gavin Kerr very much and all the other organizers of this conference for all the work that they have done. I know that arranging a conference like this can alert you from crisis to catastrophe and back again and try everyone's patience. So I'm very grateful to Gavin and all the others who participated in organizing this. It is absolutely a terrific conference. So with that said, I am then going to begin the lecture. The lecture is called The Problem of Mourning. The problem of evil is so perennial a topic in philosophy that it sometimes seems an icon for philosophical puzzles that can't be solved. Only the most tendentious among us would deny that there's suffering in the world. How is that suffering to be explained? How is it supposed to be reconciled with the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God? From the ancient story of Job to the most recent efforts of theodicy, there have been very many varying attempts to come to grips with these questions. And in other work, as the introduction explained, in other work, I myself have tried to delineate the successful defense against the argument from evil. But what is much less noticed in connection with the problem of evil is what would be left still unexplained if any of the attempts at theodicy were successful. In this lecture, I want to try to explain what this leftover problem of evil is. Then I want to explain what the traditional Christian response to that leftover problem has been. In this short lecture, I'll not be able to do more than sketch both the problem and the traditional response. But I hope to show that there is an important part of the problem of evil that merits much more discussion than it has so far received. As the story is told in Judaism and Christianity, in the beginning, God created everything that there is in the world. And when he had finished creating it, he saw and said that all of it was very good. In the beginning, in other words, there was only innocence and harmony within all of creation, which was not only very good, but even beautiful. The point of this part of the common theological story is to make clear that God is not the creator of human beings as they are now. As God created them, in the beginning, in their origin, human beings were like God in being perfectly good. They hurt nothing, at least not willingly, and they were lovely in all that they did. According to the story, the fact that human beings are no longer what they were when God created them is their own fault. The doctrine of original sin is the theological doctrine that is intended to explain this claim. The human beings God created broke their relationship with their Creator, fell from their original righteousness, and in consequence changed their own nature. They turned themselves into creatures with dispositions to will and to do what is harmful or unjust to others. Furthermore, the new nature of these fallen human beings was transmissible, and so was reproduced in all their descendants. From this fall, there arose all of the misery in the world as we now know it. Everything from the lamentable tendency to evil lurking in every human being, to the actual horrors perpetrated on whatever is vulnerable or otherwise open to oppression and depredation. On the doctrine of original sin, then, the current condition of human beings is attributable to human beings, not to God. Nonetheless, on Christian theological doctrine, contrary to what one might suppose, God does well to allow this change in his original creation. That's because the fall and its resultant suffering are not the end of the story of the creation or of human beings and their relation to their Creator. In his goodness, mercy, and love, God finds a way to save human beings from their evil and its consequences, including the liability to shame, guilt, and suffering. Through the life, passion, and death of Christ, God saves human beings from their post-fall human condition and brings them to union with himself, so that the human part of creation is not irretrievably ruined. In fact, it is part of the same story that in the end, the final end of the story of creation, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, so that all creation will somehow be restored to the condition of beauty and goodness that was part of God's original plan for creation. Now suppose, just for the sake of argument, that this entire theological story of creation, original sin, theodicy, redemption, and the restoration of a new heaven and earth is true. That's a lot to suppose, of course. But here's the point of the exercise. Even if this whole story is true, why does it not simply raise the problem of evil in a new form? Why does it not leave something that should be mourned? Why doesn't the problem of evil arise again, this time as the problem of mourning? In this lecture, I want to try to show you what that problem is, and also to show you the considerations that might help solve it. I won't be able to do more than that in this short time, but I hope it's enough to indicate fruitful avenues for future research. To see this largely unremarked problem of mourning, consider the story of the post-fall world from the perspective of the Creator in the story, who first pronounced his creation very good. It may be that the Creator can redeem the history of his broken world so that in the end it is restored to the Creator's original plan for it. But why should the Creator not see the whole story, with the human horrors in the middle, between the good beginning of creation and the redeemed end of creation? Why should the Creator not see that whole story as a damaged version of what the Creator had in mind when he originally created heaven and earth? Why should the Creator not find his creation, even redeemed and restored, something worthy of lament? Or think about the question this way. The biblical book of Revelation predicts an end time of great peace and beauty and joy when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. But this time comes after the apocalyptic destruction of the earth and the great suffering of human beings during the end time. Even if it's possible to show successfully that that destruction and suffering are defeated by the good of the new heaven and the new earth, would it not have been better if the first heaven and earth had just remained in their original goodness, if there had not been the intervening apocalypse? We can focus in from the extended mural of human history to the details of particular human lives and raise an analogous question with respect to individual human beings. So take, for example, Harriet Tubman. She was born a slave in the American South, and she suffered greatly as a slave. Eventually she escaped, and she spent all her long life helping other slaves to escape, often in very difficult and dangerous circumstances. In other work, I've argued that Harriet Tubman's suffering was defeated for her in the luminous excellence of her life. Through her suffering, she became the person so many people, me included, are now glad to honor. To say that her suffering was defeated for her is to say that, given the nature of post-fall human beings, there was a benefit from her suffering. And that benefit came primarily to her. And it would not have come without her suffering, and it significantly outweighed her suffering. Now suppose, just for the sake of argument, that that whole complex claim is true in all its details. Then it will be true that given the post-fall human world, God was justified in allowing Tubman's suffering, and that she herself would have had reason to think so if she'd known the whole story of creation. But consider what remains sorrowful about her life, even so. The suffering of Tubman's early life under the abuse of her slave masters lived on in her memory. And more to the point, it also lived on in the wounds on her body and in her psyche. And then there are the consequences of the deprivation she endured. She was not allowed any education in her formative years, for example. The deprivation of nurture for the mind is also a lasting suffering. What might she have been if she had learned to read as a child? What is it like to know that those around you, whom you admire, have a power of mind derived from education that is permanently lost to you because of the great injustices done to you by your oppressor? And if you would like to know the answer to that question, you can read St. Patrick's explanation of his own enduring of such suffering. He's eloquent in explaining it. So even if Harriet Tubman's suffering was defeated in the gloriousness of her life, the wounds and scars of that suffering remain in her psyche for as long as she lives, and in fact everlastingly in her life story. Because the past is permanent, her past injuries are permanent also. And so her life narrative includes the wounds and scars of those injuries forever. As far as that goes, there is biblical warrant for supposing that Christian theology must be committed to the view that even the physical wounds and scars remain in the afterlife, in the resurrected body. Consider in this connection the only set of stories in the New Testament that give detailed information about a resurrected human body. These are the stories about Christ during his earthly life after his resurrection. On these stories, the resurrected body of Jesus has still the wounds of the crucifixion, and the wound in the side of his resurrected body is large enough that an adult human hand can be put into it. If the resurrected body of the incarnate Christ keeps its wounds, then it seems that, a fortiori, Christian theology is committed to the claim that the wounds and scars of the bodies and the psyches of all other human beings also remain in the resurrection and the afterlife. So why is it not the case that there is something disappointing, something worth mourning about God's creation with the fall and all the subsequent suffering in the story? Why is there not something sad at best or devastating at worst about the lives of human persons in the post-fall world, even if those persons are redeemed and restored in the end? Why is it not the case that every human life is a depressing or a distressing variation on the beautiful thing it might have been? Or even in some cases, it's a deplorable monstrosity by comparison with the life that it could have been. Why should we not conclude that the whole story of the world is a broken version of what the original creation was supposed to be on Christian doctrine? And an analogous question arises for individual human lives. Would it not have been better for Harriet Tubman if she had lived the sort of life she could have had if she had been part of the creation as it was originally intended to be by the Creator? For these reasons, even if it's possible to justify God's allowing the suffering of post-fall human beings, because the suffering is defeated by an outweighing benefit, something still remains to wonder about. How is a theological story intelligible if it posits an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God whose creation turns out to be a defective version of what God intended it to be? How is this story to be understood if even a redeemed and restored creation still merits grief? You can think of the ordinary problem of evil as presenting a defeater for the theory that is the worldview of Christianity. Then a theodicy, or a defense, can be understood as a defeater for that defeater, because a theodicy or a defense constitutes a rebuttal against the argument from evil. But now, the problem of mourning can be seen as a defeater for the defeater, theodicy or defense, of the defeater, the argument from evil, for Christianity. And this way of thinking about the matter, even with a theodicy or defense, and even with an acceptable interpretation of the doctrine of the atonement, the claim that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God seems undermined by reflection on the depressing and distressing condition of creation. The post-fall world seems to be a damaged version of the creation as God originally made it and meant it to be. And that theological concession can itself appear to undercut the success of any theodicy or defense against the argument from evil, against theism. Consequently, although it has been largely unnoticed in the contemporary discussion, it seems that there would be something left over of the problem of evil. There'd be something to mourn, even if there were a successful theodicy. What is surprising to see is that the Christian tradition has taken just the opposite view of the matter. It reads the story of creation this way. The creation with Adam's fall in it, and all the suffering which the fall brought into the world, all of that made God's creation better, more glorious than it would otherwise have been. That is, the story of creation with the fall in it is more of a success for God than the story would have been had there been no fall and no evil in the world. I'm going to call that claim the Felix Culpa view, after an early liturgical text, which I assume you probably all know, the Exultet. The Exultet uses this phrase, Felix Culpa, to summarize the Christian view in question. Speaking of the fall of Adam, with theological audaciousness, the text of the Exultet puts the view this way: "Oh, truly necessary sin of Adam, destroyed completely by the death of Christ. Oh, happy fault, Felix Culpa, that earned for us so great, so glorious a Redeemer." The same perplexingly bold attitude toward the story of the world with the fall included that whole perplexingly bold attitude that can be found centuries before the appearance of the Exultet. In fact, it's evident from the earliest days of Christianity. To take just one example, one biblical example, in the New Testament book of Acts, when some of the apostles are imprisoned and then beaten for bearing witness to the events of Christ's life and death, the text says that the apostles came away from this suffering rejoicing, with a sense of having been honored and being allowed to endure suffering. In their view, their suffering was something to celebrate. In the patristic period, it's not hard to find expressions of this view. An attitude like that of the Felix Culpa kind can be found, for example, in the letters of John Chrysostom to his friend and companion Olympias. When Chrysostom was sent into exile by the empress, who was mad at him, Olympias had a hard time enduring her separation from him and her worry about him as he was marched by soldiers through rough territory and challenging circumstances. We have a number of his letters to her written to her while he was on that march. And the overarching theme of those letters is his attempt to persuade her to something like the attitude of the Felix Culpa view. In his letters to her, he's concerned that Olympias see the suffering caused both of them by Chrysostom's exile as a kind of gift of God's to his more trusted and more advanced people. To take just one of many examples that might be given, Chrysostom writes to her, "I would like to speak about something else that may seem paradoxical, but is true. If someone accomplishes a good thing, great and noble, but without having pain or danger or suffering, his reward will not be very large. For this reason, the Apostle Paul, when he boasted, did not boast only of the noble acts of virtue that he had done, but also of the evils that he had suffered. He did not say, I preach the gospel to such and such people, but rather, leaving aside his acts of virtue, he enumerated the evils that he had suffered, saying, in toils more exceeding abundant, in stripes beyond measure, in prisons more frequently, in danger of death often. Do you see this series of sufferings and the occasion for his boasting? Then he adds to these his works of virtue. But again, the sufferings have the greater importance, not the virtuous acts. Speaking about the sufferings he is enduring, John Chrysostom says to Olympius, remembering all of them every day, and having them always in my mind, I leap for joy, as having a great treasure in reserve. And this is why I beseech you to rejoice in all these things, to be glad, to leap for joy, to glorify God who has deemed us worthy to suffer these things. And elsewhere, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, Chrysostom sums up the view in his letters to Olympius. Chrysostom sums up that view by saying of people who are scandalized at the sight of human suffering. Chrysostom says, those scandalized people don't know that to have these sufferings is the privilege of those especially dear to God. Clearly, the Felix Culpa view is evident here. And if we fast forward to the scholastic period, we can find Aquinas explicitly affirming the same view. In the Summa Theologiae, for example, Aquinas actually cites the Exultet, and he explains the line in the Exultet about Adam's fall as a Felix Culpa by saying that God allows the evils of this post-fall world to occur in order to bring out of them an even greater good. From its inception then, and through much of its history, there is ample evidence that Christian communities and influential Christian writers held the Felix Culpa view, which supposes not that the story of God's creation with the fall and its subsequent suffering is a disappointment for God, but that, on the contrary, the world with its history of sin and suffering is better and more glorious than the world would have been if there had been no fall. It is one thing to note that Christianity adopted such a view early on and stayed largely committed to it. It is another thing entirely to try to understand why. How could the world, with all the evil in it, be somehow greater, more beautiful, more worth having than the world would have been if it had gone as God originally intended? How could the life of a human person such as Harriet Tubman be better, more glorious, than it would have been in a world without the fall? If wounds and scars remain even in the resurrected body of Christ, why would a resurrected human body not be more beautiful without them? The issue highlighted by these questions is in fact a corollary of a more fundamental issue, namely the nature of the true self of a human person. Think about the matter this way. If on the Felix Culpa view a human person such as Harriet Tubman is more glorious in the post-fall world than she would have been in the world without the fall, then what is it to be glorious as a human being? On Christian doctrine, you are able to be made glorious and perfected also in the post-fall world. But what exactly are you? There are multiple theories that might be thought to explain the notion of the true self of a human being. There's Frankfurt's concept of the person, there's the narrative account of the self, and so on, and many such theories. But in the end, I think that the notion of the true self can be understood best by first delineating the nature of suffering, and then, as it were, reverse engineering the notion of the true self from the nature of suffering. We can begin by noting that suffering can't be adequately glossed just as pain, as a little reflection will show you. On the contrary, pain is neither necessary nor sufficient for human suffering. Instead, it is arguable that suffering is a function of what a person cares about. Every human person has some care about what kind of person she is and about her being what she ought to be, or what she ought to be is something like thriving as a good specimen of the species human being. Consequently, part of what it is for a human being to suffer is for her to be kept, to one degree or another, from thriving in this broad sense of thriving. What makes a human person thrive, however, is an objective matter, and so there is an objective element in human suffering. On the other hand, what human beings care about has a subjective element too, which doesn't have to do just with thriving. The subjective element is something to which a person is committed, but which need not be essential to her thriving, and which may not even be compatible with it. This is a matter of the desires of the heart, as the psalmist says. Not easy to give a crisp formulation of that notion of the desires of the heart. But we can say that the desire of the heart for a human being is a particular kind of deep commitment to a person or to a project, a commitment that matters greatly to her, altogether apart from her own thriving. Consequently, if we take suffering to be a function of what a person cares about, then suffering can be understood this way. A human being suffers when she fails to thrive, or she fails to have the desires of her heart, or both. We can use this view of suffering as the basis on which to sketch an account of the true self. If in heaven a human being is her true self in its perfected state, and if in heaven she does not suffer, then in heaven she has harmoniously ordered both thriving and heart's desires. She has the convergence of what she cares about on both an objective and a subjective scale of value. So we can think of the true self of a person as the emergent condition of that person when she has what she most cares about, in both an objective and subjective sense, and when her deepest heart's desires converge with her thriving. The true self of any human being thus has both an objective component, which is the same for all human beings, namely thriving as a human being, and it also has a subjective component, which will vary in some respects from one human being to another. Furthermore, the true self will not be a sum of the objective and subjective components. Rather, it will be what emerges from the interweaving of the human being's thriving with the fulfillment of her heart's desires. We can fill out this delineation of the true self by considering that on Christian doctrine, human beings are made in the image of God. The perfection of a human person's true self will thus also be the fulfillment of that image in her. That something is an image of something else in virtue of somehow resembling it. To be in the image of God, then, is to resemble God in one way or another. The perfection of a human being's true self will therefore also be an intensification of that resemblance in her. We can think of the resemblance between a human being and God in different ways because on Christian doctrine, God is triune. And as God is one and only one deity, and yet there are also three persons in that one God. So a human being can be considered to be made in the image of God in virtue of resembling somehow the nature of the one deity. Or, on the other hand, a human being can be supposed to resemble God in virtue of somehow resembling the three persons in their loving interaction. Both of these ways of thinking about the image of God in human beings are well represented in Christian theological thought. But there is yet one other way to think about the image of God in human beings. On Christian doctrine, God is also incarnate in Christ. On the Chalcedonian formula for the incarnate Christ, Christ is one person, the second person of the Trinity, with two natures, one fully divine and one fully human. The things predicated of Christ in his human nature are predicated of the second person of the Trinity. And since each person of the Trinity is God, the things predicated of Christ in his human nature are also predicated of God. That is why in Christian doctrine it is true to claim that God suffers, even though in its divine nature it is not possible for God to suffer. And so yet another way to think about the image of God in human beings is to consider the resemblance between a human being and Christ in his human nature. As evident in the Gospel of John, there is biblical warrant for the Christian claim that the incarnate Christ is most glorious in his crucifixion. That's the explanation typically given for why the wounds of the crucifixion remain in Christ's resurrected body. In fact, on Christian doctrine, the nature of God is most manifest in the crucified Christ. That's because the only divine attribute picked out in the New Testament as expressive of God's nature is love. 1 John 4:8, God is love. And there is biblical warrant for the claim that there's no greater love than the love of a person who lays down his life for the sake of another. In this way of thinking about the matter, then, the nature of God is most evident in Christ's crucifixion, because love is greatest and most evident there. Consequently, it's possible to see a third way of identifying the image of God in human beings. If it is the image of God in human beings that perfects the true self of a human being, and if the nature of the love that is God is most evident in the crucified Christ, then there may be some way in which the wounds of human suffering could intensify the image of God in a human being too. In the epistle to the Colossians, the Apostle Paul says, I rejoice in my sufferings for you, and I fill up that which is wanting in the afflictions of Christ. And in the epistle to the Romans, he says, we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and heirs with Christ, if we suffer with Christ, that we may be glorified. If these evocative and suggestive lines can be suitably explained, then it may be possible to see a way in which the wounds of a person's suffering could become for that person an image of God. On this way of thinking about the perfection of the true self of a human person, what perfects a human person is her resemblance to the incarnate Christ when the love of God is most manifest in him. So here's what I want to say in conclusion. There is a perplexing problem of evil, the problem of mourning, which remains even if there is a successful theodicy. The traditional Christian resolution of this problem of mourning is the Felix Culpa view, namely the view that the post-fall world with all its suffering is better than the world would have been if it had been what God originally created it to be, and there had never been a fall. This claim implies a comparative evaluation of worlds, and like the comparison of whole world views, a comparative evaluation of worlds is difficult to assess. But the problem can be approached more easily by considering the smaller scale comparative evaluation of human lives that it implies. On the Felix Culpa view, it is possible for a post-fall human being in his true self to be more glorious than he would have been in a world without a fall. That is, in a world without the moral evil and the suffering of the post-fall world. The smaller scale comparative evaluation requires some understanding of what is being compared. Evaluating the Felix Culpa view thus requires some insight into the nature of the true self of the human being. It's arguable that the true self of a human being is the emergent condition which results from the convergence of his thriving and his deepest heart's desire. When this emergent condition is perfected, the image of God, which on Christian doctrine is in human beings, that image of God is also perfect. With this much elucidation of the nature of a human being's true self and the perfection of it on Christian doctrine, there is some clue about how the Felix Culpa view could be defended. If the love that is God's nature is most evident in the wounds of the incarnate Christ, and if the wounds of human suffering could somehow be suitably connected to Christ, then there would be a basis for an argument that the wounds of a post-fall human being can render him more in the image of God than he would have been had there been no suffering in the world. In that case, on Christian doctrine, there would be something more glorious about redeemed human beings with wounds than there would have been had there been no fall, no suffering, no wounds, and no scar. On this view, it is the image of love incarnate that makes a wounded post-fall human person more glorious in his true self than he would otherwise have been. And the image of love incarnate in the true self of a human person would have been less or non-existent in a world without a fall. In the end, then, the last perplexing part of the problem of evil, that I call the problem of mourning, that last perplexing part of the problem of evil, which remains even if there's a successful theodicy, it's inextricably interwoven with the notion of the true self of a human being and an understanding of God as love. If the true self of a human being is perfected when the image of God is most fulfilled in him, and if the nature of God is most manifest in the love of God, then we may be able to see how the Felix Culpa view might be defended, and how this form of the problem of evil might find a resolution. So there is an important problem of evil that merits more discussion than it has so far received. In this lecture, I've tried to show what this problem is, and I've just sketched the basic lines of the traditional Christian response to it. To deal with that problem and this traditional response in detail and in depth would take a lot more work. But I hope to have done enough here to show what that problem of mourning is and indicate something about the issues that it raises. In my view, this is a very fruitful topic for future research in philosophy of religion. And with that, I am done. Thank you.